Sarah and I recently started renting a small house in a suburban town on Long Island, New York. It's a modest place, just the right size for 2 to 4 people, with a backyard that's perfect for grilling or enjoying a quiet evening outside. Our street is peaceful, almost eerily so, tucked away from any major traffic or commotion. One side of our house is bordered by a water drainage basin, basically just a clump of trees surrounding a sump, and on the other side is Kyle's house. He's an older neighbor in his 60s who lives with his wife, and they're about as quiet as neighbors can be. Across the street is a small patch of woods with another drainage basin behind it. For someone who likes privacy, our house should have been a dream. But then there's the backyard. It's fenced off on all sides, and Kyle's house is separated from ours by a row of thick, overgrown bushes that the landlord planted years ago. Most of our yard is secluded, except for one glaring exception. The house directly behind us has a clear view into our backyard, and it's that view that turned our little rental from cozy to unsettling. It's fall as I'm writing this, and we've been doing the usual yard work, raking, clearing leaves, and prepping the garden for winter. Over the past few weeks, I started noticing something odd every time we went outside, 2 people standing at the upstairs window of the house behind us. It was always the same man and woman, both middle-aged. They didn't just glance out the window or idly look around. They stared, long, unblinking stares, every time we were in the yard. At first, Sarah and I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe we were overthinking things. But as the days went by, it became impossible to pretend we didn't notice. The unease grew with each rake of the leaves, every trip to the garbage bins, and every gust of wind scattering more debris across the yard. Sarah became so uncomfortable that she refused to step outside. I wasn't far behind her. One foggy afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I was out raking leaves again, the cold dampness of the air settling into my bones. I glanced up at the window, and there they were. Their silhouettes were just visible through the misted glass, watching me. A strange mix of frustration and defiance rose in my chest. I decided to wave at them. Maybe a friendly gesture would break the tension. I raised my hand, smiled, and waved. Nothing. No movement. No acknowledgement. They just stood there, their eyes locked on me. I could feel their gaze, as if it had a physical weight. It took everything in me to turn my back on them and continue raking. I tried to focus on the rustle of the leaves and the scrape of the rake against the ground, but curiosity got the better of me. I stole another glance. They were still there. That was it. I couldn't stay outside any longer. I dropped the rake and went inside, my heart thudding in my chest. Sarah had had enough. "Let's just go over there and introduce ourselves," she suggested. "Maybe they're just curious because we're new." I was hesitant, but Sarah was persistent. We walked around the block to the house behind ours and rang the doorbell. My pulse quickened as we waited. When the door finally opened, it didn't reveal the man or woman from the window. Instead, a younger man, probably in his 20s, peered out at us through a crack in the door. His face was half hidden in shadow, and the inside of the house was eerily dark. "What do you need?" he asked curtly, his tone flat and disinterested. We introduced ourselves and tried to explain why we had come by, but he didn't seem to care. When I mentioned the 2 people we'd seen at the window, he looked at us blankly. "I don't know who you're talking about," he said. Something about his demeanor made my skin crawl. We left as quickly as we could, but as we walked down the driveway, I glanced back. The man was still standing in the doorway, watching us until we were out of sight. Back at home, I went upstairs to our bedroom. One of our windows looks out directly at the house behind us. Against my better judgment, I lifted the blinds. The 2 figures were there again, staring right at me. Even from that distance, I felt the intensity of their gaze. I slammed the blinds shut and went downstairs to tell Sarah. We decided to plant some arborvitae trees along the fence line to block their view, but it was too late in the season. We have to endure the winter. A few days later, we heard a knocking sound in the middle of the night. I told Sarah to stay in bed while I went to check. The sound grew louder as I descended the stairs, and I realized it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from one of the backyard windows. My heart pounded. The blinds were shut, but I could hear the unmistakable sound of a fist against the glass. I froze. Then, gathering every ounce of courage I had, I flicked on the backyard light. The knocking stopped instantly. I didn't dare look out the window. I left the light on and went back upstairs, telling Sarah that I'd scared off whoever it was. I didn't want her to know how terrified I'd been. Since that night, nothing has happened until last night. We were lying in bed when we heard screaming. The sound pierced the stillness of the night, loud enough to carry through 2 sets of closed windows. I rushed to the bedroom window and opened it just enough to listen. The screams were definitely coming from that house. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the screaming stopped. Silence fell over the neighborhood. We almost called the police, but something held us back. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that we wouldn't be believed. I don't know what's going on with that house, but Sarah and I are officially on edge. I'll update if anything else happens, but for now, we're just trying to get through each night without looking out the windows. My 2 kids, Sam and Robbie, are 6-year-old twins. A year ago, we lived in our old house. It seemed fine at first, but something happened that forced us to move. It's a long, scary story. I lived in that house for 4 years. My wife, Carol, and I got married there, and we had our kids there, too. The neighborhood had started changing for the worse, but we still planned to stay for a long time, until everything went wrong. Our house was on a corner. Behind us, across the intersecting street, there were tall trees and thick bushes blocking the view of the house back there. We never saw those neighbors. But the neighbor on our right was a man named Steve. He had moved in less than a year before everything happened. I had only spoken to him twice, and both times I could barely understand him because of his thick accent. He didn't seem very friendly. 2 of his upstairs windows overlooked our backyard. There wasn't much privacy because of that, but I'd never seen lights on in those rooms. I figured they were guest rooms or unused storage spaces. One hot summer day, Sam and Robbie were playing in our backyard. They were splashing around in their blow-up pool and shooting water guns while I did yard work. At one point, I walked toward the detached garage. That's when I saw Steve at his window. It startled me for a second, but before I could even react, he walked away from the window. It was strange, but I didn't think much of it and kept working. Later that day, as the sun was setting, the kids went back outside to play again. It was still hot, so they jumped back into their pool. Carol and I were in the kitchen while she made dinner. The kids were laughing and shouting, but suddenly, they got quiet. Then Robbie came running inside. He said he saw a flashing light coming from Steve's window. I followed him into the backyard and asked him to show me. Robbie pointed to one of Steve's upstairs windows, the same one I saw him in earlier. Robbie said there was a white light flashing from that window. I felt a chill run down my spine. I asked both kids if it looked like a camera flash, and they both said yes. I told them to dry off and come inside. I helped them dry off and brought them in. I went to tell Carol what had happened. She immediately assumed the worst, just like I did. Carol told me I should go over and knock on Steve's door, so I did. When I knocked on Steve's door, no one answered. His car was in the driveway, so I knew he was home. I knocked and rang the doorbell several times, but he didn't come to the door. Frustrated, I went back home and told Carol he wasn't answering. This made the whole situation feel even more real. We couldn't prove the flashes were from a camera, but it sure seemed like it. It was deeply unsettling. Weeks went by without any more incidents. Then one night, Carol and I were in our bedroom when we heard the sound of our side gate being opened and closed quietly. Carol nudged me and told me to go check. I turned on all the lights and stepped outside to search the yard. I didn't see anyone, but I noticed the lights in Steve's backyard were on. I walked over to the fence to take a look. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest when Steve suddenly appeared on the other side. He asked, "Do you need something?" I asked him if he had seen or heard anyone sneaking through our yard. He said no. I decided to confront him and asked if he'd been watching my kids. I mentioned that they thought someone had taken pictures of them in the pool from his window. Steve's reaction was strange. He got extremely defensive and acted offended, almost like he was trying to cover something up. He raised his voice and accused me of making wild accusations. Without any solid proof, I didn't want to escalate things, so I apologized and went back inside. Carol wasn't happy. She was sure Steve was lying. A few more weeks passed before the scariest incident happened. It was the middle of the night, and we were asleep when Carol woke me up in a panic. I sat up, trying to understand what was happening. Then we both heard the kids screaming from their room. I jumped out of bed and raced downstairs to their room. Robbie was awake, crying and screaming. His screams had woken up Sam, who was also crying now. Robbie said someone had been outside their window and that he saw a camera flash. My blood ran cold. I asked, "What did he look like?" Robbie said he didn't see the person clearly. I didn't want to take any chances, so I brought both kids up to our room. We all stayed in bed together. I turned off the lights and looked out our bedroom window, which faced Steve's house. I scanned each window, and then I saw him. Steve was peeking out from one of those upstairs windows, the same window that overlooked our backyard. That was it. I stormed out of the house and rang Steve's doorbell over and over again. I must have pressed it 15 times. He never answered. Furious, I called the police. I filed a report on Steve so they'd have it on record. I hoped that if he did anything similar to anyone else, the police would investigate. After that night, I never saw Steve again. I even sat outside a few times, hoping to catch him leaving or coming home, but he seemed to avoid me completely. We couldn't take it anymore. Within a month, we moved to a new house in a nearby town. The new neighborhood has been much safer and a better place for our kids to grow up. But sometimes, I still think about Steve and those nights. I hope we never run into someone like him again.